Yes, so thank you so much for the invitation. Very, very nice. I think I might have interpreted the invitation slightly differently to some. So I got this email saying, well, it's going to be SPM Homecoming and all the SPM people are going to come. You're going to give a talk. And I thought, oh, sweet of them. They want to know what I've been up to in the last 10 years. So it's not going to be the latest and greatest. Instead, it's just going to be a little bit talk about what I've been up to for the last 10 years. So think of it as a kind of what I did during my summer break kind of essay, and it's the last 10 years. Is it that one? Yes. Yeah. So what I've been doing for the last 10 years is diffusion. And diffusion, you usually see it like this, nice tracks going like this, or nice structural connectivity. But unless you've worked with it, what you don't see is what the data actually looks like. And the data tends to be quite rubbish, to be honest. It's not very anatomically faithful, and this is the susceptibility distortions that you will know about, which I've done some work on too. But it's also not internally consistent. So this is not someone who's moving around with a scanner. These are just differential distortions in the different frames. And what I'm going to talk about today is the work I've done on this particular problem here. So in order to understand that problem, we first need to understand a little bit about diffusion and how we acquire diffusion data. So what we do with diffusion is we acquire a number of different images, each and every one of these images being sensitized to movement or diffusion of water molecules in one particular direction. So if you put on a diffusion encoding gradient in the x direction, that means that you're sensitive to diffusion or movement of water molecules in the x direction, and you have a loss of signal in those areas where water moves easily in that direction. So you can see that you kind of lost the corpus callosum there. If instead you use a diagonal diffusion gradient like this, you can see that you lose it on the one side. If you have a diffusion gradient that goes in the same direction, so into the image, you can see that you have complete retaining of that signal there. So this is what we're doing with diffusion. This is sort of the crux of the matter. So remember, we're acquiring many of these images, each of them preceded by a diffusion encoding gradient. And this is the problem, because these diffusion gradients need to be very strong, and they need to be switched on and off very fast. And it leads to these lingering off-resonance feeds. And what I've done here is I've sort of illustrated this as a scaled down version of the diffusion encoding gradient itself, which is not quite. I mean, it's similar to that, but it's not quite as easy as that. But essentially what it means that because every image is preceded by a different diffusion encoding gradient, these off-resonance feeds that come from them are different for each and every volume. And that is what causes this. So this is what we're doing here, is we are simply playing a movie through the different diffusion encoding gradients, or the different volumes. And by the way, this is not a particularly bad example. This is actually quite a good example where the eddy currents aren't too bad at all. So we need to solve this in some way, or I think I should solve it in some way. And for people working with SPM here with John, so, well, that's going to be easy, isn't it? We're just going to use some mutual information and register them all together, and that's solved. But it might be more difficult than one might think. Increasingly, people want to use high beat values in order to solve sort of fine details in the microstructure. And also, when you're and when you're doing that, and you also typically want to have high resolution, so you want this to be registered quite well. But if you look at these two images, there's not a lot of mutual information there. So there's not much to drive a registration based on mutual registration. And that's sort of the whole idea of it as well. I mean, if we had the same information in these two images, we wouldn't need to acquire both of them. So this is the problem we're faced with. So it makes it hard to use traditional image registration. So what I decided, or what I suggested we do instead, is instead we register predicted images. So this, what you have here, is simply data from one single voxel, right? And the signal for a given volume, which is defined by the diffusion gradient, either direction from the origin here and out to that point, So the distance from the origin, that's the strength of the signal in that particular voxel for that diffusion gradient. So you can see that we have sampled the whole sphere of different diffusion gradients here. So we have all of these different points. And what I suggested, well, why not use a Gaussian process? It simply assumes that there's some sort of smooth variation as we go from one diffusion gradient to another. So, and because of this this oversampling of Q space, that means we have a lot of information, so that if you want to know what the signal should be in a diffusion image that's required with that, we simply fit this surface to all these points and say, okay, that's our prediction, what it's going to be. And this is just what the Gaussian process looks like, and we can estimate the hyperparameters quite easily from the data itself, and it's a very fast estimation to do. So this is the way that we predict images. And then I put this into a framework that looks like this. So for all the scans, so these are the different diffusion gradients, different volumes, I use my current estimates of the susceptibility field, eddy current field, movement parameter, etc., to unwarp that, and then I put that into the prediction maker. I pass that on to the Gaussian process. And I do that for all the volumes before I then go to the next step, so that for all the scans, I get the prediction back from the prediction maker, or from my Gaussian process. I invert the current transform. So I sort of use the inverse transform for this, and I get the prediction back into scan space. And in scan space, I can then compare it to the actual data. And the point here is that because this prediction is now based on all the data and not just on the data that had that particular diffusion gradient, this will be in a diffusion space that is defined by all these different images. So it's going to be different from the actual scan. So we get a difference there, and we can use that to update the eddy currents and the motion parameters. And then these two steps together is one iteration of the eddy algorithm. And then just keep going around and keep going around a little while. And yes, after the talk, I look forward to seeing if John considers this to be a sort of proper generative model or not. Interesting. Okay, so back to the data. So this is some MGH data, 198 directions, p-value 10,000, it's quite high. And this is before correction. This is after correction. It's quite hard to see what's going on here. But I will ask you to look specifically at this little salsa here. And for the next slice, what we're going to have here is we're now going to have blown up this. And what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to squint. If you squint properly, you squint, you can look at it here, and you can compare to it here. So you can see that here, this little salsa actually just jumps up and down. You wouldn't really want to apply a diffusion signal model to data like that. Whereas after the correction, you can see that it actually lies very still. So it's sort of done a good job there. So it works quite well, but subways also moves, and movement is a particular problem in diffusion imaging, all sorts of reasons. So when subways move during the diffusion encoding part of the sequence, i.e. when you're applying the diffusion sensitizing gradient, as you can imagine, because we're sensitizing ourselves to movement, right? So if there's actually a movement, subway movement, exactly coinciding with that, we're going to have more or less a complete signal loss. So that's one problem. Another problem, which SPM people are familiar with, since it's sort of based on work that Abraham has field, is that the susceptibility induced field changes when the subject moves. So that is how the susceptibility field changes as the subject moves around. Not going to talk about the reverses, I'm just going to pick one of the problems that we have, and that is that it's not the case that when you have a subject in the scanner, he's absolutely still for the duration required volume. And then if it's going to move, it's going to move a millisecond before you then start applying the next volume, etc., etc. That's not how movement works. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of motion correction works. So I thought I would try and work with that, and this is known as the slice to volume problem. And this just demonstrates what you get, because in diffusion we tend to have alternate slices. So we first acquire all the odd slices, followed by all the even slices. So if there's some sort of movement going on here, you tend to get this quite sort of ragged outline or seesaw outline here. which describe characteristics of that kind of movement. So, but because we have this generative model, it's quite an easy problem to solve, actually. So all you do now is you sort of essentially fill up your Gaussian process, your prediction maker. So now you have a volume of predictions, right? Now that you have this volume prediction, you can slice that any which way you want, right? So you want to know, okay, so this particular slice that I have here, what does that correspond to in this volume? So you just essentially take slices through that volume of predictions until you find predictions that match that slice the best. And I thought this would be quite a difficult problem, but it turns out it was actually quite an easy problem. You get excellent results with very high accuracy in the estimation. But a more difficult problem is the problem that once we know how the subject moved, right, we then need to recreate a volume, the volume we would have had if the subject hadn't moved. That's a bigger problem. The reason this is a bigger problem is the following. So what we have here is a subject that looks up. So halfway through the acquisition, he does this, right? So that means we start acquiring here, and we go up. And then as he looks up, this part here is shifted into the part that has already been acquired. So we have a wedge here that is simply not acquired at all. We have a wedge here, which has been acquired twice. So how do we deal with this? More generally, how do we deal with sort of resampling? Well, it's essentially, so think of it as a deck of cards. So you have a deck of cards, and so you can fan this deck of cards out, and also think that it's kind of it's a magician's deck of cards. So they can also be angulated in this direction, and they can be intersecting and what have you. So you have all these sort of cards sitting in space. So how now do we take those, given that we know exactly the positions of them, how do we recreate volume we would have had if we haven't had that movement? So deck of cards, and the second thing I want to think of, so imagine that we have a bunch of needles, right? So one needle for each center of each loss, and the equidistant needles. You take those needles and you have a bunch of cards, and you stick those needles straight through this bunch of cards, right? Now, every point where a needle intersects one of these images, right? This is the point that we want to interpolate. And then we can do a bog standard, spline 2D interpolation within each of these slices where the needles hit that particular slice. Once you've done that for all the slices, then along each needle, you have interpolated values along the Z direction, right? Unevenly spaced. So then what you do is you do a sort of irregular spline resolve, which means having to solve a system of equations, but that's fine. But also combine that with supplementing the data with predictions. So in the place if you don't actually have data, you can then use the predictions from our generative model and put those into there. So you can actually regenerate the volume quite well. This is just an example of someone who did a still scanner. So you have to look at the first column here and the last column. So from the first column, you see someone who's an elderly subject moving around the scanner, and you would essentially say, well, there's nothing we can do. It's useless. When you look at the last column, you see, well, actually, these data look really quite nice. So we've been able to clean this up and turn a clinical, potentially useful study into something quite useful. And this is just to demonstrate that what we do with the intra-volume movement, i.e. the sliced volume alignment, is we're actually putting things back in the right place. And it's actually, it's worked surprisingly well. It's great. Much for that. So 10 years I've been working on this, solving these problems. So the natural question to ask then becomes, okay, so how much longer do you think you can float this particular data was? And the answer to that is until every time, I hope. So these are my sort of plans for the future. Well, this is actually this one we have just submitted. It's a paper where because typically what we do is for a given volume, right, that is then defined by a particular diffusion gradient, we assume that the eddy current induced field is the same. for all acquisitions, right? But as it turns out, what we noticed at some stage was well, actually the slices belonging to the first one or two MB groups, the multiband groups, are actually not corrected as well as the other slices. So what could that be? And we realized, well, actually what happens here is you have this eddy current and it extends into the sort of image encoding part of it. But then it keeps on extending, right? So when you then apply the same diffusion encoding gradient the next time, you actually get a little bit more. So you have a slow build-up of these eddy currents at the beginning of each volume. And at the end of each volume, you also then have a slow decay of those. So at the start of the volume, what you have is actually a mixture of the eddy currents from the previous diffusion gradients and the eddy currents from the current diffusion gradient. And that was something we managed to sort of figure out and solve. That was quite nice. Second thing, so this is work that's pretty much done, but we haven't written it up yet. So if you look at this one here, so this is a subject from the HCP. He moved a lot. We sort of tried to fix everything as well as possible. But what you can see is you have sort of areas of higher intensities and lower intensity that seems to move up and down here, right? If you look at this, and what's happening here is, he is in a inhomogeneous received bias field, right? An inhomogeneous received bias field is not a problem for diffusion because it just comes out in the wash when you're modeling the diffusion. Same for fMRI statistics, it's not a problem unless the subjects actually move quite a lot to that, because that means that for a given part of the brain, for a given voxel, that actually goes into higher sensitivity, lower sensitivity, higher sensitivity as you're doing that. And obviously that would be nice to fix. Oops, easy from your and what we realized there was that, well, okay, so it's a problem if we have movement. It's not a problem if we don't have movement. But if we do have movement, that means we can actually use the brain itself, or the subject itself, as a kind of probe. So here's just an example of where the voxel center for a given voxel ends up, in the different frames as this subject moves. So you can think of each and every voxel in this person's brain as a little probe as you move around in this received bias field. And from that, you can get an estimate of the received bias field. And again, it seems to work surprisingly well. Finally, what I hope to do is to adapt eddy to the Fly data with Freddy. Because there are various things in eddy right now that we can use for diffusion, which would be useful for fMRI as well, such as the intravolume movement, transvolume, the movement in each received bias field, sustainability movement, which is already in SPM, sadly not in FSL yet. And then after that, I'm planning to retire to build boundary fly rods. So this is from last year when I went to Switzerland to learn how to build boundary fly rods from Albert Einstein, no less. The student have faked his own death in order to be able to retire up to the Alps and build boundary fly rods there. Thank you very much.